Imagine yourself on a train. The darkness outside is almost a vacuum. The cabin lights flicker with every jolt, and the only sound is the metallic lament of the rails beneath your feet. You are alone, or so you think. This isn't just any journey. It's the night passage leading to a destination you'd never expect. Those who have made it say the cars hide secrets, that silence is a trap, and that, sometimes, a shadow moves through the darker corridors. A shadow that shouldn't be there. And what if your cabin, your only protection, suddenly opened to something more than the dark? Tonight, you will discover why certain doors should remain locked forever. It was just past midnight when Sarah settled into her cabin. The night express to Blackwood was known for being an almost forgotten line, used more by solitary travelers or those who preferred the quiet of darkness to the bustle of flights. Sarah was one of those souls. The cabin, small and cozy, smelled of old fabric and a slight mustiness, an aroma that, paradoxically, brought a strange sense of familiarity and solitude. She had always felt more at ease in the vastness of the night, where shadows seemed to hide less than daylight. But tonight, there was something different. An oppressive silence hung over the cars, a silence that seemed to absorb any trace of life, even the muffled sound of the train's own wheels. It was a silence that screamed absence. Sarah was in car 3, cabin B, a random choice dictated by last-minute availability. She pulled a book from her backpack, a worn edition of Gothic horror tales, hoping the fiction would ward off the growing unease in her chest. But the words danced on the page, and her eyes constantly drifted to the window, where the dark landscape merged into an indecipherable blur, occasionally punctuated by a fleeting glimpse of twisted trees or abandoned houses that seemed to watch her on her journey. The darkness outside was so dense that it reflected her own face in the window, a pale, disturbed image that seemed to contort with every movement of the train. Suddenly, a sharp creak cut through the silence of the corridor, coming from somewhere further down the car. Sarah startled, the book falling into her lap. She waited, tense, for the sound to repeat, but nothing. Only the train's steady rhythm and, again, that abnormally deep silence. It was as if the train itself was holding its breath. She forced herself to relax, attributing the noise to the old car's settling structure. But an icy sensation, a shiver that didn't come from the cold, crawled up her spine. It was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't ordinary fear. It was a growing paranoia, a whisper in the oldest part of her brain that said, "You are not alone here." The night wore on, and exhaustion began to weigh on Sarah's eyelids, but the unease was an insurmountable barrier to sleep. She tried again to focus on the book, but with each turn of the page, the feeling that she wasn't alone intensified. Her ears, previously focused on reading, were now sharpened, catching every tiny deviation from the train's monotonous silence. A subtle rustle, a slight drag coming from the corridor of car 3B, the same one where her cabin was. It was a sound so faint it could have just been her overactive imagination, echoing on the fringes of paranoia. But Sarah couldn't ignore it. She got up from the bed, her bare feet touching the cold carpet of the cabin floor. Her heart beat a rapid rhythm against her ribs. She approached the door, the aged wood seeming thinner, more fragile than before. Her face was inches from the crack where the corridor light barely entered, and she could hear, now more clearly, a dragging sound, intermittent, as if something heavy was being slowly pulled across the floor. It wasn't the usual rattling of the train, it was deliberate, with a strange cadence. A chill ran through Sarah as the sound seemed to draw closer, stopping exactly outside her cabin. The air in the small train passage seemed to grow heavy, dense. Sarah could swear she felt a cold breath from the other side of the door, even if there was no crack to allow air through. Time stretched, each second an impossibly long eternity. Then, a tap, light, almost imperceptible, like a fingertip sliding across the wood. 1, 2, 3 slow, deliberate taps. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to back away, to make no sound, to play dead. But curiosity, the same curiosity that led her to read horror tales in the dark of night, held her there. She moved her eye to the bottom crack of the door, trying to see if there was anything in the shadow of the corridor. Nothing. Only the absolute darkness that the train seemed to drag with it. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. The feeling of being watched was no longer a suspicion. It was a chilling certainty. Someone was there, and they were waiting. The tapping on the door had ceased, but the silence that followed was infinitely more terrifying than any noise. It was a heavy silence, laden with anticipation, like the air before a violent storm. Sarah was still motionless, inches from the cold wood, her heart pounding erratically in her ears. She felt the presence on the other side, like an invisible pressure against the door, a malignant force that seemed to want to break through the barrier. Her instincts screamed for her to back away, to hide, but fear had completely paralyzed her. Minutes dragged on, each one feeling like silent torture. The darkness of the corridor, seen through the door's crack, seemed even denser, more alive. It was then that Sarah noticed something. Not a sound, but a distortion in the faint light filtering from the adjacent cabin, which created a tenuous reflection on the polished wood surface of the door. A reflection that, for a fleeting instant, revealed a silhouette. Tall, slender, and completely motionless. It was a dark shadow, almost indistinguishable from the shadow itself, but undeniably present. The shadow seemed to be facing away from her, or perhaps bent unnaturally, observing something in the car. An icy shiver ran through every fiber of Sarah's being. It wasn't her imagination. Someone was there, standing, in the narrow corridor, so close she could feel the faint warmth of the body, or the deadly cold. She couldn't tell. But what was most disturbing was the figure's absolute immobility. There was no movement, no discernible breathing, just that icy presence. It was as if the entity was waiting for something, observing with chilling patience. Sarah slowly backed away, her eyes fixed on the door, as if a sudden movement might awaken the creature on the other side. She dragged herself to the furthest corner of the cabin, curling up, desperately trying to control her own breathing, which seemed deafening in the claustrophobic silence. The image of the shadow in the door was etched in her mind, a dark stain in her peripheral vision. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying desperately to banish the image, but it was ineffectual. A terrifying thought infiltrated her terrified mind. What if it wasn't a reflection? What if the shadow was, in fact, inside her cabin, and what she saw in the door was just a trick of light, a mirage of terror? Time dissolved into a blur of dread. Sarah didn't know how long she had remained curled in the corner, her body rigid, her eyes tearful with terror fixed on the door that now seemed the only barrier between her and the darkness that watched her. Her ragged breathing filled her ears, mixing with the infernal screech of the train. Suddenly, the corridor light, which had barely filtered before, flickered. A single, brief oscillation that revealed, for a split second, not a reflection, but something moving in the crack. A glimpse of a slow, contorted movement that she couldn't identify, but it was enough to make her stomach clench into an icy knot. Panic propelled her. She needed to get out. If the door was opening, she couldn't just wait to see what would come next. With trembling legs, Sarah crawled to the door. Her hands were sweating as she fumbled for the doorknob, feeling the coldness of the metal under her fingers. She twisted it, but the door remained motionless. She tried again, harder, but the mechanism seemed jammed. The doorknob wouldn't move. A feeling of despair washed over her. She was trapped. She pulled out the key she had received upon boarding, an old, brass key with an unusual shape. She tried to insert it into the lock, but the keyhole seemed to reject it. She turned the key in several directions, but it simply wouldn't fit. It was as if the lock had changed, or as if the key belonged to another dimension, another reality. The frustration, mixed with fear, made her eyes water. She was trapped, not by a mechanical failure, but by something inexplicable, something that was deliberately keeping her there. As she desperately tried to manipulate the key, Sarah heard it. A scratching, soft at first, but then it became a repetitive, scraping sound coming from outside the door. It wasn't the sound of fingernails, but something harder, rougher, like metal being dragged slowly across the wood. And then, a laugh. Low, guttural, but undeniably a laugh. Not a human laugh, but something hollow, emotionless, that seemed to come from within the car itself. A sound that promised darkness and despair. Sarah dropped the key, which clinked on the carpet, and recoiled, her eyes fixed on the door, knowing that whatever was out there was no longer just observing. It was enjoying itself. The laugh, that hollow, soulless laugh, twisting in the air, seemed to come from all directions, from within the walls, from beneath the seat, and, most terrifyingly, from within her own mind. Sarah felt her sanity slipping away with each passing second. The scraping sound at the door had stopped, replaced by a silence even heavier than before, a silence that seemed to mock her despair. She was paralyzed, her eyes fixed on the doorknob, expecting it to turn at any moment. Then, the corridor light flickered again, this time for a slightly longer period. And it was enough. In that lapse of time, Sarah saw, outside her cabin, in the exact spot where the door crack had revealed nothing, hung a mirror. An oval, antique mirror with a dark, carved wooden frame, hanging on the corridor wall where there had been nothing before. And in the reflection of that mirror, Sarah didn't see what she expected. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a person. It was her own face. But it wasn't her face, not as she knew it. Her eyes were empty, her smile a lifeless, twisted caricature. And, most disturbingly, behind her in the reflection, in the dark depths of the cabin that should have been empty, there was a figure. A slender, almost translucent form, standing behind her, with its arms outstretched, as if about to envelop her in a cold embrace. The creature in the reflection was so close that Sarah could feel its icy breath on the back of her neck, even though there was no one behind her in the real cabin. The light flickered again, and the mirror vanished, leaving only the absolute darkness of the corridor and the still-locked door. Sarah collapsed to the floor, sobs catching in her throat. It was an endless torture, a macabre dance between the real and the surreal. She could feel the presence now, heavy, suffocating, filling every inch of that cabin. And then, a voice, whispering, tearing through the veil of her mind, directly into her soul. Madness is a refuge, but few find it before fear consumes them completely. It was a quote she knew, from an ancient treatise on the human mind and its most primitive fears. But spoken with that voice, coming from within, it felt like a condemnation. Sarah closed her eyes tightly, wishing it was a dream, a nightmare, anything but the terrible reality of being trapped, watched, and losing her mind, miles from any salvation, in the heart of a night train that seemed to have forgotten its destination. The train plunged into complete darkness. A tunnel that seemed to stretch for an eternity. The silence, then, was no longer just heavy. It was absolute, swallowing the sounds of the train, Sarah's sobs, her very breath. The cabin became an impenetrable black pit, and the only thing Sarah felt was the biting cold spreading through the air, an icy presence that was not the train's, but something beside her. She didn't need to see. She knew. It was there, finally. An icy whisper brushed her ear, and the voice, that hollow, lifeless voice, repeated the quote, this time with a macabre tone of triumph. Madness is a refuge, but few find it before fear consumes them completely. And then, the voice added, there's a truth you've forgotten, Sarah. At that very instant, the train lights returned, flickering violently before stabilizing. Sarah blinked, her eyes burning, trying to adjust to the sudden brightness. The cabin was exactly as she had left it. The key fallen on the carpet, the Gothic book open on the floor, her backpack tossed in the corner. The mirror had vanished. The scratching sound and the laughter were gone. The air felt lighter, but still carried a trace of must and something indefinable, as if the darkness had left a mark. Sarah looked at the door, her prison. The doorknob was there, intact, the lock looking perfectly functional. With trembling hands, she tried it. The doorknob turned effortlessly. The door opened. The corridor was empty, completely empty. She stumbled into the corridor, hesitant, each step a battle against the fear that still paralyzed her. The other cabins were silent, their doors closed. There was no sign of a shadow, a mirror, nothing. Was it all a nightmare? A hallucination induced by fear and isolation? Sarah staggered to the corridor window. Outside, the train slowly began to emerge from the tunnel, revealing a gray, rainy landscape. The first faint light of dawn began to seep in, revealing distorted shapes of bare trees and abandoned sheds. And it was then that she saw it. At the end of the car, on the opposite side to where she was, where corridor 3B met 3A, there was a door. A door she hadn't noticed before, as it seemed to be merely a continuation of the car wall. But now, under the faint light, she could distinguish the rusty, almost faded letters on the wood. Emergency exit, do not open. And just below, scrawled in chalk, as if by a child, or by a trembling hand of despair, there was a phrase. It never leaves. It just waits. Sarah's stomach churned. Whatever had happened, madness was not a refuge. It was the truth. And the truth was she was never alone on that night passage. She turned abruptly, her eyes sweeping across corridor 3B, the same corridor where the shadow had lurked, where the laughter had echoed, where her own distorted reflection had been displayed. And then she noticed. In the darkest corner of the corridor, almost imperceptible, lay a small object on the floor. A shiny object, reflecting the pale light. It was a fragment, a small piece of mirrored glass with a carved wooden edge. It was all that remained of the mirror that had vanished. And in the reflection of the small fragment, she saw, for an instant, not her face, but something writhing in the dark depths, a slender, twisted form that was not human, and that seemed to beckon to her, inviting her to join the darkness. The train jolted violently, and the mirror fragment flipped over, revealing only the dirty carpet of the corridor. Do you really think this is just a story? That fear is just a trick of the mind. Think again. Next time you're alone in a dark place, on a night train, or even in the silence of your own room, remember, sometimes doors don't open. And forgotten truths, they never truly disappear. They just wait. Are you sure you're alone right now? Comment below if you believe what Sarah experienced was real, or if you've ever felt an invisible presence. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you awake.
If you enjoyed this creepy story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more chilling tales every week. Stay spooky!